This week we've brought the Antiques Roadshow to the northwest corner of Wales and the island of Anglesey. We've crossed the Menai Straits by way of Thomas Telford's magnificent suspension bridge, who come here in their thousands as holiday visitors. The castle is one of the finest examples in Europe of the concentric design, with perfect symmetry on all four sides, and it commands the Menai Straits, which separate Anglesey from the Welsh mainland. The real growth of Beaumaris came in the 19th century. The British love of the seaside is a relatively recent passion. For most people, the coast was simply inaccessible, and it wasn't until the paddle steamers began bringing trippers from the ports of Lancashire that the holiday trade here really began to develop. Fine houses like Victoria Terrace were built in the 1830s by architect Joseph Hansom for rich industrialists from the north and the Midlands. But Hansom also designed for the harsher side of Victorian life. Beaumaris Jail was built by him too, and unfortunate inmates under sentence of death took their last march to the scaffold along this corridor. Contemporary accounts tell us that the public came out in great numbers to witness the grisly event. Beaumaris is also the home of a museum of childhood. Mementos of youth and their growing interest to collectors is something I'll be returning to with Hilary Kay a little later in the programme. Our home for the day is the leisure centre here in Beaumaris. So let's now join our experts with the people of North Wales.
No, I'm not a collector. They've been in the household as long as I can remember.
Time,
yeah. Yes.
This little beaker here, which has a very nice verse on it, friendship without interest, love without deceit, printed one way up there and then the other way. I have to put it up the other way to see the print on the other side. This is cream-coloured earthenware. This one's made about 1820, and I suppose it unfortunately has a little damage here, worth about 50, 60 pounds, which is... did you treasure it or...?
No, not at all. It was just there in the cupboard with the odds and ends, buttons and what have you.
Well, I think I should take the buttons out of it. This is almost even nicer. After creamware had run its course, as it were, as the main material for making English pottery, the potters started making pearlware. And to do that, they used cobalt in the glaze instead of iron, which is in the cream-coloured earthenware. And so we've got this lovely jug. And we have here the date, of course, as you can see, 1829, tells exactly when it was made, beautifully painted around the top here and printed with the farmer's arms.
Yes.
And in those days, literally thousands and thousands of jugs were made with different mottos, farmer's arms, blacksmith's arms, God trust the plough and so on. But this is in a particularly lovely...
My father kept the knives that he used for the pig killing in it.
Really? In it?
Yes. And the thermometers that he used for the cheese making.
Well, that's lovely. And there's not much, well, there's no damage to it. It has a lovely verse on about the honest old farmer, and that's a splendid jug, and I probably will surprise you. The value of that today in auction is going to be between 350, 450 pounds.
Good gracious, yes.
Now, the last jug, I just reach it, is a little later. This has a mark on the bottom, Elsmore and Foster, there. And that tells you the makers. And in fact, you probably know this, it's a kind of puzzle jug, isn't it?
It trickles water.
It trickles water. You pour water in, and unless you put your finger over that little hole there, it all comes out of the base there.
Yes.
It's got a print of a coloured print of a clown on, said to be based on the clown Grimaldi, famous clown, and a rather unpleasant scene here of a cockfight, which ends with the death. Well, again, a nice jug, 1845, 50, something like that, a little later than any of these, and certainly worth 100, 150 pounds. So you brought a very nice, thank you.
Take care of them a bit.
Will do, please.
Right,
yes,
thank you.
Cwpwth Trydan.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, that's very simple. It simply means 3 pieces.
That's right.
And you can see here very clearly, top section 1, middle section 2, and the bottom 3.
That's right.
And that's the difference between a Welsh cupboard, if you like, and an English one, and the fact that the Welsh ones have very commonly these 3 pieces. What I love about this is the size.
Yes, it's not as big as a lot of them, is it?
It's very interesting, because when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe that this top was actually made at the same time as the rest of it. But it all matches up. All the colour is the same at the sides. The panelling is the same at the sides. It's obviously all been made in one piece. Well, the style of these is a sort of 17th century style, either 1600s.
Yes.
But what dates this more accurately for me into the middle of the 18th century, about 1750, is these fielded panels here, these arched Gothic-y OG panels here, which is typical of, well, the second quarter of the 18th century up to about 1750.
Yes, possibly.
And that, I think, is pretty consistent
Yes.
with the date of this type of thing. It's a wonderful colour. Have you been looking after it?
Well, it was very neglected. To my horror, I found people standing on top of it to paint the ceiling. And I managed to get a lot of the paint off. And it was very dull in colour. Somebody said to me I'd had it French polished. No, it's just art graft.
Right. These handles I would date to about the 1870s. They've got a Victorian, Japanesey aesthetic movement look about them, 1870, 1880.
Possibly. It was in a farm. We're farmers. So, you know, I think there was a lot of use.
But it's so nice. You've got this lovely colour here. You can see very clearly these medullary rays of the oak, which is the giveaway of oak, the way the growth rings grow here. A nice dowel here, slightly standing proud as it should do. And this lovely bit of turning here. All a lovely, lovely colour, all matching up nicely. Everybody likes them. They're so sweet. They'd go anywhere in a house.
Yes.
And it would certainly make at auction between, well, certainly between £2,500 and £3,500. And locally it could be worth even perhaps a little bit more.
The colours sort of work so well together, don't they? When you get a great range of Staffordshire from the best period, the 1850s, 60s, I mean, that's the brilliant blue colour which really jumps out. And it sort of goes so well with the other bright oranges and yellows. There's something about them been very British, I think. And this one made for the export trade. And really made in rural Staffordshire, titled on the base Gold Washington. But of course the potters themselves had never seen George Washington. The orders came to send a figure to the American market and they hadn't got an image to do. So what have they done? They've taken a figure which they had already of Franklin, the other American. I suppose they felt that overseas that would do. And they titled it Washington. They dressed him up as almost a British admiral and off it goes to America to sell for a few cents there. But Franklin as Washington normally commands about £220, £250 in that sort of range. Here you've got almost a contradiction to the idea of Staffordshire flatbacks. On one side you've got the sailor, on the reverse side a soldier. So one side always facing the wall, a double-sided figure, which is most unusual. How long have you had this one?
I've had that one about 30 years.
Are these things you bought locally?
Well, I bought that one locally, yes. I bought it in Llangefni, actually.
Can you remember what you gave for it then?
£7, I think I paid for that one when I bought it.
That one, as an unusual model, is probably now worth about £350.
It's good investment.
That one's done really well, but you see, a collection that gives a lot of pleasure and keep on adding to it.
Yes.
Look at this lovely picture of cats at play. But it's a picture with a difference, isn't it?
Yes.
Can I give it a wind?
Yes.
Where did this come from?
We had it at home in the nursery.
Yes.
And it was meant to send the children to sleep. So I can date it back easily to 1899, and before that it came from a cousin in Granby Hall in Nottinghamshire.
Wonderful to be able to trace it back so accurately.
Yes.
It's doing a little bit of movement. Ah, there we are. Now it's doing its little dance. And just look at the complexity of that movement at the front there. We've got the movement of the cat's head and the arm holding the bow, and the little children at the side, the little kittens jumping up and down. But to me, the real excitement is looking at the back, because talk about held together with a whisper and a prayer. It's the most extraordinary mechanism when you look inside, isn't it? Look at that. I mean, it doesn't look as if it would work for more than 5 minutes, and here it is, well over a century later, working as well as the day that it was made.
I'd be interested to know if you think it's continental.
Yes, I'm certain it's continental. I would have thought that it was made probably in Germany.
Yes.
Yes, date-wise we're talking about, I would have thought it was made in about 1885. Value, I would have said between about £400 and £600 at auction, because of this wonderful amusement and the novelty, and as we saw in the back a minute ago, the technology to put together this extraordinary mechanism that has let it continue to work for 100 years.
This is an item we acquired when we moved up to North Wales here, 2 of them actually, one square and this round one.
Goodness, what is this?
And it's I understand, a beetle trap.
A beetle trap?
Cockroach trap.
Oh, amazing.
You put the bait in the centre here,
yes.
The cockroaches came along, climbed up the side, fell on there, and disappeared inside.
And it's called the demon, I see
That's
here.
a demon, yes.
Isn't it wonderful? I remember there was a thing called the Roach Motel. It's a sort of, this is an old-fashioned Roach Motel, and the slogan was, they check in, but they don't check out. So it's the same sort of thing.
You've got to have the text, which is English. This is the English edition, because it's the 2nd edition. And you look for the fold where it came out of the atlas. And if that's an original fold, then it's almost sure to be an original map.
Very good. And the speed of Anglesey is actually quite a desirable map, isn't it?
Yes, it's not a very rare one. Although Speed did it, he actually first published it in 1611 to 1613.
Yes.
This, you'll see, is 1629, and therefore is a 2nd edition, which was re-engraved and sold by Sudbury and Humble. I think that, at auction today, you'd have to pay about £100 for it.
Gosh, this is terribly exciting. The mark on here is the very first electroplate mark ever. Look at it, first of all, just thought, well, it's an electroplate sugar base and somewhat worn. The mark is that of Elkington and Company, and you get elec in one word, tro in the next, plate in the next, and they actually took out the patent in the 1840 period, and that mark was only used in 1840. So that is actually one of the very first pieces of electroplate ever made in the world. I have not seen that mark before. I've seen it in the book, but I've never seen it on a piece.
And what's this say?
Y ddraig goch very cychwyn.
And what does that mean?
The red dragon that started.
Right, and so this is obviously the Welsh dragon. Now, who carved this? Do you know anything about the history of it at all?
Only that my grandma gave it to my dad when he was a boy.
Right, so your grandma. It's probably a little bit older than that. It's made of oak. The idea of them is late 17th century, so 300 years ago. But most of them, especially these small ones, we're quite close together here, were made probably in the late 19th century. Yeah, these are the fighting dragons, which I think we see down below. They just about have their battle here. Who won?
The Welsh dragon.
The Welsh dragon, right. So what's it worth? It's a family piece. You haven't had it insured or valued it at all.
I don't know.
You like it as an object?
Yeah.
It's quite comfortable, isn't it? And you can hide lots of things in here. Something like this, because I think of the Welsh connection here, it's worth much more than I would normally say. And I think you'd have to insure it for around about £1,000, something like that. It's quite a lot of money.
I asked you if you knew what it was because it would have been quite nice if you could have told me, because I don't quite know what it is myself. I know what it is. It's Japanese and it's bronze. And I know who the people are. This is a god of good fortune called Hote. And he's always accompanied by 2 boys. And this is his bag of treasures, and he brings good luck to you. And we've got all sorts of different things on here, which all signify luck and good fortune. We've got sort of lucky papers, money, bags of money. We've got precious objects. We've got Diakoku's mallet. He's another of the god of good fortune. He has a mallet. Fans, and an Oni mask. An Oni is a devil. And this curious-looking thing, which looks like a sporran, is the tail of a long-tailed turtle, which means long life. Where did it come from? It's a very unusual thing to find, really.
Well, as the story goes, our great-grandmother was a lady's name to Lady Kennedy, who apparently was, her and her husband were ambassadors in Japan.
Ah, when?
So, must be 1850s, sometime around there.
And I would date this more likely to be the 1860s rather than the 1850s. In fact, 60s, 70s.
So it hasn't got a use as such?
Well, I mean, if this were a Japanese I mean, it was made in Japan, but it's not made for Japanese consumption. This is an export piece, which is why one says that it gets into the 1860s, because it didn't really get going until then. If it were a Japanese object, you would put charcoal in there, and it would either be an hibachi for warming your hands, or for putting incense in. And in fact, even though it was made for export, some of these were made as incense burners, but then you would have a hole in the lid, let smoke out, just put the lid back on again. And it hasn't got that. So it's a bit difficult to know, as I said, what it was made for. I think it's just a decorative box and cover. And he really is quite an expensive thing, because he's very well cast. I think that that would sell for somewhere around £1,500 to £1,800.
Oh, my goodness.
Surprised?
Yes. Yes.
Good old great granny.
It belonged to my great grandfather. We don't know whether he bought it or whether he commissioned it. He moved over from Ireland to this country to live, penniless, and established the Cooperage in Liverpool. We don't know, again, whether he bought it or commissioned it.
Well, it would seem entirely likely in that case that he commissioned it, because this is a cooper's workshop.
That's right.
A very accurate record from the plane to the lathe, well, and then we come to his bench with all the, whatever you make barrels out of, the planks.
Right.
Here is his pipe. Here are all his tools. It has a title, it's called Bellows to Mend. It's a sort of excuse for this wonderful view, because we come across to see the old cooper scratching his head as the kids, this one with rather a impish face, are asking to mend this old pair of bellows. Do you think it could have been his own workshop?
It may well have been his workshop, for all I know, yes. Could well have been. I don't actually know what my great-grandfather looked like, so I can't tell you whether it's a good likeness of him or not.
The artist of this painting, Joseph Wrightson McIntyre, whose signature we can see clearly here, is actually a marine artist, well known for his stormy coastal seas. So this is quite a departure for him. I don't know whether you insure it or whether you've even thought about such things.
It's just in the normal household insurance.
Yes. Well, I think that because it's such a wonderful view and it has such a marvellous personal history, I would have thought something around £6,000 to £8,000.
You surprised me.
The curious thing about these things, we're talking about a Japanese style. They are Japanese in style, but they're almost certainly Chinese in origin. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my life in my hands. I'm going to take one of these apart and look for the mark. So we'll take off the lid and we'll upend this one here. And there, the mark, as it happens, says that it's the period of the Emperor Qianlong, an 18th century Chinese emperor. But that's not the case. These were probably pretty new at the time you bought them. Maybe in a couple of hundred years' time, someone will be collecting these. And the way that they will, in a few hundred years' time, tell that these are 20th century and not 18th century is, and I'm going to show you that now, looking very, very closely at the design. The design is actually outlined in black, and that black outline is actually a transfer print. Then when you come to the red part of the design, they've used a red transfer printed outline to give you the difference in the red parts of the design. Let's just twizzle this round a bit here, because as it happens, I've got something right behind me here which is quite useful to compare with. There we have a piece of Japanese porcelain of about 1890. And this, you can see, is exactly the sort of colour scheme they're imitating. And if you compare like for like, you can see the difference in the veining of the leaves, how that is actually a transfer print, and this is actually done by hand. Can I ask a terribly rude question? How much do you pay for them?
I think it's between £700 and £800.
Okay, right. At that price, it's not a bad price to pay for something that's big, something that's very ornamental. And we talk about antiques, but all antiques have been new sometime.
Yes, it looks like a rather sort of sophisticated bronze, doesn't it?
Yes.
But it is, in fact, a cast iron money box. And the museum here has got really quite a collection of these. And I picked this one because it's one of the more sophisticated ones. money boxes of this cast iron variety tended to come over from the States, and it's interesting to think why people began to hoard money in the first place. And in the Civil War, when a lot of paper money was being produced, people actually lost confidence in paper currency, and they wanted to hoard coins because
I'd always associated money boxes with childhood, hence the Museum of Childhood where this comes from. But so adults were saving money in this particular way, keeping piggy banks at home because they'd lost confidence in.
To a large extent, that was the case, because in the Civil War, they didn't know who was going to win, and Confederate money, who knew whether that was going to be worth anything. So they kept coins, and these marvellous banks were produced. But this is quite sophisticated. It's a reclining Chinaman bank made by a company called Stevens that were based in Connecticut. And
where does the money go?
The money goes in there. I can see you've got. I don't know if it accepts 20p pieces.
Pretend it's a dime.
Okay. And then you push down the lever, and there.
Up come the aces.
Up come the aces. And it was a sort of allegory of I suppose, the Oriental workers who were shipped into the States, and they were accused of lying around all day playing cards. So this was a bank really representing that, but a super one, and one of many that are here in Beaumaris.
So hold on to your money boxes.
Indeed, particularly if it looks like this.
A lovely claret jug. It's lovely, I think, with the handle, the way the snake just curls around, forming the handle and literally snaking all the way around, right up to the top, and then just popping over the top just so he's about to capture the butterfly.
Yes. Well, when I bought it, I had it in mind that my husband was the snake and I was the butterfly.
Right. The maker, in fact, is Barnard's.
Yes.
And they were one of the most important firms of the 19th century. And in fact, their marks, we can see very nicely just there, the Barnard mark. The actual date is 1856.
Yes.
And that ties in very nicely with what we've got underneath here, which is this design registration mark.
Yes.
That is actually for 1854. There's a much more modern inscription here, though, in Latin. Now, my Latin is hopeless. Can you translate for me?
Well, that is our part of the story, because I bought it as a silver wedding present for my husband, and
Right.
the Latin means I have loved, I love, I will love.
Oh, that's delightful. I do.
So that's
like
our
that.
edition.
I love that. Right. That's good. And what I'm terribly pleased about is that you put that inscription underneath.
Oh, yes, yes.
Because so often I find that people will have put a modern inscription on the outside of a
Yes.
piece, and it does so often ruin a piece.
Deter from it, yes.
Today, I think for insurance, you'd have to think in terms of at least £2,000.
Oh, really? Yes, that's a nice increase.
So-
We'll have to do the diamond wedding as well.
Right.
Now, the Sèvres factory has got more problems than almost any other ceramic factory. And the reason was that it was owned by Louis XV and Louis XVI as sort of their own personal property. And it maintained a fantastic quality control because it was meant for prestige, not for making money, really. That meant that if anything misfired in the white stage, it was stored. And in about 1800, all this blank porcelain was sold off, bought by Staffordshire decorators, who promptly put on Sèvres-style decoration onto the blanks. How are we going to tell whether we're looking at A, a piece of genuine porcelain which has been later decorated, or B, something which is in the style of, but never came from Sèvres in the first place? And there are several things we can look at. The first is this colour. This is rose, or as we call it in this country, rose pompadour, named after Madame Pompadour, who of course was a mistress of the king. It was her favourite colour, and it was a very expensive colour to make. It was derived from gold. But this is not the right pink. This is too blue and too washed out to be the real thing. Can you see this little Puto's eye? It's a blue dot. He's got blue eyes, and you don't get blue eyes in the 18th century. They're always brown. So that, more than anything else, you could say, fine, it's 19th century. And the Sèvres burnishing was, it was phenomenally good. better than anybody else has ever done. This is simply not good enough. Further, it falls apart on the dating. There's one other thing. You see this little hole here?
Yeah.
That was done at Sèvres and at Sèvres alone. And it was a firing process. They put a little, I don't know if this will work, they put a little hole in there and they fired their porcelain on a pin like that, right? Now, if there was glaze in it, it would stick. So if you're checking something, you look to see whether there is glaze in that hole, and there is. So it couldn't possibly be right. It's still a very good decorative cabinet cup and saucer, and it's worth £300 to £400. Not bad for a forgery.
That's lovely.
I've got good news and bad news for you here. I don't know which one you'd like to hear most, but I'll give you the bad news first. The bad news is that basically Hendrik Barent Koekkoek is probably one of the lesser members of the Koekkoek family. But the good news is that this is probably one of the best pictures that I've seen by him. He normally paints much smaller pictures than this. So what we have is possibly one of his masterpieces. Tell me, how did you acquire this picture?
Well, it came from my grandfather's house. My grandfather, I believe, bought it in the 1920s, and I believe he paid about £5 for it.
£5. Well, the first observation that I'd make seeing this picture is that it's very much inspired by Dutch 17th century landscape painting. Now, the interesting thing is that Hendrik Barent Koekkoek came to London in 1882, and so the question here is, was this painted in England or was it painted in Holland? My feeling is that it was probably, might well have been painted in this country. Have you any thoughts at all of what it might be worth?
Well, from paintings that I've looked at in books, I would have thought between 1,000 and 2,000 possibly.
Yes. Well, no, I think you're being too modest, because I would think that it's certainly going to be worth between £4,000 and £6,000 and could well be worth a bit more. But I think was it your grandfather who paid £5? Was obviously a very astute man.
I believe that it was originally owned by my great-grandmother, who lived at 4 Lane Ends and Tarpley in Cheshire. She left it to my grandmother, who was from Hoylake, and she in turn left it to my mother, who left it to me.
Stylistically, it's quite easy to date. Firstly, the general shape is typical of what is known as the Sheraton Revival. It's such a tiny, small, jewel-like piece, though. But when you actually look at the individual parts as a whole, it's got a lot of Georgian features in, but with one or two things which date it to exactly that period, the turn of the century, late Victorian, early Edwardian, 1900. Firstly, these struts here. This idea of this projected column was revived by somebody called McMurdo, a designer in the 1880s, 1890s.
We've always called it a lady's desk. Now, is that right?
I think because of the scale. I mean, it is quite a small piece, isn't it? I mean, when you actually realise how low down the writing surface is, it is quite a small piece, certainly not for somebody very big. But whoever's owned it, lady or gentleman, it's in exquisite condition. Everywhere you open it, it's fresh, almost as though it's completely new. Obviously not. What have we got here?
That's the secret compartment.
What the butler wasn't supposed to see in there.
That's right, exactly. Right.
That's lovely, isn't it? But beautifully made. It's so fresh. It's as though you could imagine that it's a new piece of furniture. It's obviously not been used very much. It's been in one family, which makes a lot of difference.
It's been in our family, well, as I say, since my great-grandmother's time.
Look at the colours here.
That is beautiful. I've always thought that, the way the colours have been preserved on that inlay, I've always liked that.
And then when you close it, you've got this, I mean, just too much to talk about it, almost. You've got this glorious vase of flowers here, inlaid on a satinwood ground, with mahogany bandings, and mahogany here quartered, with again a satinwood along the edge of it. This is glorious. You get this in gilt bronze in France about 30 or 40 years before this, so he's incorporating a French motif in this very modernistic, structural, architectural piece of furniture, but a tiny lady's writing desk. And again, we just can't ignore this drawer here, this beautiful handle, all gilt metal, beautifully cast. Everything is quality, very nicely made. I bet it was quite an expensive piece. If you go into a shop to buy this, you'd have to pay a good £3,000 for it.
I wouldn't part with it, no way.
And lots and lots of other accessories. Oil tanker, another one, rails, water tank. Yes, I mean, this all looks as if it's 1950s in date. That looks like a station. Look at the condition of that. Almost like a mirror, isn't it? That was a good step there. Wonderful, wonderful condition. Well, a collection like this, because it's in such super condition, I would have thought would be worth £300 or £400.
Your grandmother's, yeah. What does it say on the bottom? Fireproof? No, it can't say. It just said fireproof.
Can't tell what it is.
Can you read that, John? It looks so fireproof or something. It cannot be fireproof.
It does say fireproof.
It says fireproof, doesn't it? Well, you know why? Because it's got fireproof on the bottom. You know why? So you can put it on a hob, on the old-fashioned hob. Almost certainly this was made in Derbyshire, around about 1880, 1890. So, I mean, it's quite. That's quite a collector's item, that.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, in an antique fair, you could expect to be looking at £150, £200.
This is the standard work, the history of the building and description of the Menai Bridge. A fabulous book. The bridge, of course, was built by Thomas Telford, but just look at the quality of the printing, the way the book is made. The title page, Indian paper, every leaf, every sheet of it has got a watermark in it. Many of the copies are cut down, but this is a full elephant folio. Superb. We then come to these incredible architectural drawings. They describe in the greatest detail every single component of the bridge, every bit of metalwork, every bit of stonework, every lever, the whole lot. At the very back here, there are a series of wonderful engravings of all the views of the Menai Bridge. I would estimate that if this went to auction today, I would say certainly any auctioneer would be pleased to accept it with a reserve of £2,000, and with competition it could make £3,000.
How long have you had it?
I would say about 80 years.
80 years? Well, you might be interested to know that it comes from Ceylon.
Oh, indeed.
Yes, and the date roughly would be about 1800. And that's the time that the British troops went to Ceylon and they put down King Candy in Ceylon. The troops used to bring these back as souvenirs. The blade is conventionally steel. The grip is ivory, all beautifully carved, inlaid with silver. And then the sheath here of heavy brass. But all piacchettas look like this, whether you have a one half the size or larger. They're all the same style and shape and carving. But that is the name of it. It's a piacchetta from Ceylon, about 1800. And the value, would you like to know the value?
Not really bothered.
Well, I'd better tell you anyway, and then you'll look after it a bit more. It's worth about £350 to a collector, because this is a particularly fine specimen. There you are.
It is a pretty chunky gentleman's pocket watch.
Yeah.
This is in fact a half hunter. If you can imagine, before the days of cars, most travel was on a horse. And open-faced watches have glass the whole way across the dial, and if you fell off, you smashed the glass. So some clever person came up with what we call a hunting case watch, which is effectively double-sided, so it looks like that back and front. Then when you're riding along and you want to see the time, you have to flip open the lid, which is sort of a bit of a problem. At the lid, you often buckled the case hinge. So somebody came up with this idea called a half hunter. In other words, you could pop it out of your waistcoat or your pocket and at a glance see the time as you were riding. So there's a potted version of why we refer to the different cases as hunting and half hunting. Let's have a further look at this. A white enamel dial, the difference being that for the half hunter it's got a small chapter ring which you can see through the little glass, because obviously if you didn't have those central figures you wouldn't be able to read the time.
Have you ever opened this before or not?
I haven't, I'm afraid, no.
So you probably haven't seen this beautifully pierced and engraved balance cock,
No, I haven't.
which protects the balance wheel itself. And I see that it is signed by a man called Kleiser of Hereford. Also signed F. Kleiser of Hereford. These things inside the back, do you know what they're called?
No idea.
Well, they're watch papers. Have you ever had them out at all or not?
No.
No?
No, I didn't even know they were there.
Right, well, let me show you something, because this can be very, very interesting. Well, there we are. There's a few. Still got one left in there. Now, when the watchmaker repaired or looked after the watch, he normally wrote on the back, certainly a date. And here we are. Look at all these. Various dates. It's obviously 1876, 1880 there, and 1883. So every few years, the watch has been cleaned and overhauled, and very often, they actually had the cost, which might have been 1 and 6pence in the old money. So a social history in itself with these little watch papers, which are now on their own very collectible.
Really?
A few pounds each to collectors of watch ephemera. It's a lovely example of its type. It's never going to make you a fortune, but at auction at the moment, probably in the region of £250.
This has got to be one of the rarest pieces of English porcelain. Where did you get it?
Well, I bought it from a sort of, not a car boot sale, but it was a stall. It's a garden face at Sandringham.
So this came from a garden fete?
Yes, on a charity stall.
Well, I've got to ask what you gave for it.
Well, I paid £3.
Did you know what it was you bought at the time?
I just liked it, and then at the time I sort of looked it up when I got home in the local library.
And what were we able to find out?
Well, I thought it was a Worcester, and I thought the artist could have been James Rogers.
I mean, you're spot on. The distinctive thing that makes it Worcester is the colour of the glaze. It's very much bluer, that's not as white as Meissen, it's a soft English porcelain. The colours, the palette is unique to Worcester, the rather soft greens and yellows, and especially this flame red in the decoration there, which is a very distinctive colour. So we now tend to use the term Rogers type for these because there were several hands at work, Worcester of that time. The pattern is called mobbing birds. I think they're great fun, aren't they? Always amused, what are they trying to do? It seems a little sparrow-like bird squawking at the owl, and he's sort of startled out of his wits, and he's got his ears pricked up there. And then as the phoenix-like bird is taking no notice and just preening his feathers, ignoring the silly little birds going on around him. And it has a very tiny chip, enough to make a slight difference, but not much. But I'm sure if it was to collect, it would be comfortably valued at £6,000.
Gosh, lovely. Very nice.
Is it something that you wear?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised. It's the sort of thing that is very hard to find in perfect condition nowadays. I don't know if you can just see there, Hunt and Roskell were the manufacturers. They were a firm working in the UK in the 19th century, particularly making this rather exquisite, sumptuous jewellery with things like gold and enamel and stones. But the blue enamel really lends itself to mounting with gold. And if you just take that out there and place the piece there, we can see that the blue enamel contrasts beautifully with the gold on the back. Then the earrings, matching, lovely diamonds as well, and the diamonds and the gold and the blue enamel contrast superbly. And you've got this sort of spiral technique where you've got the blue and then the white forming this sort of integral pattern. It really is a lovely piece. One of the great problems with things like this is that it inevitably chips. The enamel gets damaged. So when you can find something that's got the diamonds, it's got the style, in the condition that it was in when it was originally manufactured, it's terribly, terribly rare. I think that if this was being sold in one of the sale rooms, because of the condition and because of the quality and because of just the sheer singularity of the item, I think, as I said, it stands every chance of making maybe £3,500 to £4,000 in auction. And as a retail replacement, to actually insure the item, I think you'd probably find that that would retail for maybe £6,000 to £7,000.
Quite a pleasant surprise.
Well, I've been told that it's a pillbox carried by Japanese men.
Well, that's indeed quite right. They did use it for containing all sorts of small items. It's called an in-row.
In-row.
This little ball is called the ojime, and that should be at that end, holding that shut.
I see.
Okay?
Yes.
This is called the netsuke.
Yes.
Here we've got a lacquer one, and this type is called a manju netsuke because it resembles a rice cake, and the Japanese for rice cake is manju. How did it get to Anglesey?
Well, it belonged to my grandfather, and he used to go to Japan about 100 years ago on business. He was in the cotton trade.
Really? This one dates from the second half of the last century. We've got 2 pheasants on here on rocks. The rocks have got details with little squares of gold foil. That's actual gold underneath a clear lacquer. The manju netsuke is actually super as well. It's a really very, very nice combination. These are called mon, and they are the badges of princely families in Japan. It's actually a very nice combination. I would think those two would sell for somewhere between £1,500 and £2,000.
Really?
Yeah, really very nice.
I had no idea. Absolutely no idea.
Well, that brings us now almost to the end of our visit to Anglesey today, but not before one final story. You'll be aware of the phrase, smoking is bad for your health. Well, I think that must have had a rather hollow ring for one man serving in the trenches in the British Army in the 1914-18 war. He was obviously a smoker himself, and it saved his life. This was his cigarette case. The German bullet struck it here, as you can see, did considerable damage to the case, but undoubtedly saved his life. And with that story, we really do come to the end of this edition of the Antiques Roadshow. Our warm thanks to the people of Beaumaris and beyond who've made